Hello, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. In this episode, we talk to Scott Peitzer, better known as the Booze Cube, about his understanding of law magic on the plane of Ravnica, specifically in context of the Azorius, Orzhov, and Boros guilds. We were super lucky to have Scott on for this podcast, and we got to learn a lot about the way the legal system in the real world works. Without any further ado, let's get to the show.
Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. This episode, we are talking about Ravnica once more. It is Return to Ravnica season, and we're helping you learn how to be a good tourist to the plane of Ravnica. And one of the things you need to know when you go to any new plane is the laws. You need to understand what to do and what not to do when you get to your new interplanar locality. And so we have a special guest coming on this episode to talk to us about just that. But before we get to the description of the Ravnican legal system, we're going to have all of our hosts and guests introduce themselves. And I want you to tell the listeners what crime you might be caught for if you ever made it to Ravnica.
I'm Hobbs-Q, and mine is pretty simple. I mean, I'm kind of think of myself as a pretty active person, and I really hate the guild structure, which is going to be something that we're going to get into later on. So I think that I am probably going to get arrested for helping lead the guildless in a revolt against the Ravnican guilds. I mean, I think pretty simply it's going to be me alongside Cranko.
I'm on Twitter at Alexander Newman. I'm Alex Newman. And mine is much less political and more goofy, because that's kind of my speed. To just to paint a picture here. So, Hallowed Fountain, the art from Return to Ravnica. This wonderful fountain in the middle. It's got these great waterfalls coming down these wonderful sort of curved buildings. I suspect that if I found myself on Ravnica wandering around, I might get arrested trying to make a water slide out of one of those things.
See, this is why I like working with Alex. He is so pure and just like childlike in a great, beautiful way, because I thought he was going to say public urination.
That might be mine. I'm Scott Peitzer, also known as the Booze Cube on Twitter, and creator of the drinking game of the same. I'm going to go really arcane here and say that I would probably be caught for barratry, which is a common law offense where it's you're basically for bringing repeated litigation for the purposes of profit or harassment. So, I mean, I'd obviously be an advocate in Ravnica, but I think I would get a lot of pleasure out of just tying up the Boros Legion and Selesnya in court for fun and profit.
And I'm your host, Joe Redemann. You can find me on Twitter at Findhorn. And I think I would get arrested for summoning an entire pack of Thunderheads and commanding them all to scream at the top of their lungs, "Show me what you got!"
Oh my gosh.
We're mixing Rick and Morty in here too, baby.
God. I would probably arrest you for that myself.
This little dabble into the darker side of law is the other half of what we're talking about today. We're going to talk a little bit about the flavor of Ravnica and its legal system. So the first thing we wanted to sort of jump into is the history of law magic on Ravnica. So what is it about Ravnica that makes it so important to have a magical legal system? Booze, you're our legal expert here, so why don't you take the first crack at that?
Sure. I think the most obvious thing is that you have a lot of people living in a relatively small space. So you've got a high population density, which means people are going to be stepping on each other's toes. And that's, at a fundamental level, what law really needs to be able to do, is get the Hobbesian Leviathan to keep life from being nasty, brutish, and short.
Wait, did you just call me brutish and short?
Well, I just called you short.
I mean, it's from a flavor perspective and a story perspective, it is the city plane. It's the most sort of social civilization based plane I think that we've seen in Magic the Gathering. It's the most sort of modern in that sense. You know, we have places like Mirrodin or Kaladesh which are a little more sci-fi-y, but this is the most it seems like it's the closest to our time in a believable sort of way. Does that sort of make sense? And so it seems like there need to be those same sort of social systems in place.
Yeah, it's less technologically like the real world, as you were saying. Kaladesh is a little closer to that, but I think in the structure of society, like Scott said, there's a lot more people in Ravnica, so there's bigger cities, and even if the cities look more medieval European than our cities do, the actual population density and thus social fabric of those cities is going to be a lot closer to ours, because you need that structure to manage that many people that close together.
Let's go to history section here. This is all the backstory. We touched on this a little bit in the last episode where Alex and I mentioned Azor and the beginning of the Guild Pact. So, broad terms, the Guild Pact was the social contract. It was the magical social contract that bound all of Ravnica. And it was signed by the original 10 Peruns, or founders of the guilds, and was instituted and sort of put into place by Azor, this Sphinx planeswalker, who we later found out in the Ixalan story is kind of a dick. But so Azor had that guild pact put into place, and for thousands of years, it was followed to a T. If any guild stepped out of line, the magic of the guild pact that bound the plane pulled them back into line and enacted punishments and repercussions. Eventually, at the festival of the guild pact, I believe it was 30,000th or something, some ridiculous number, where they celebrated this peace and all the, joy of having a sustained magical society. One of the Boros Wojeks, the law enforcement officers, Agris Kos, arrested Sadek, the head of House Demir, exposing House Demir to the public. This was back when they were secret, generating a loophole in the guild pact that the Demir had planned on exploiting, and breaking the guild pact. And then all hell broke loose, and when people weren't bound by this magical law, they started to do whatever they want because they hadn't done that. And it was super nuts for a while until a new guild pact was created by Teza Karlov, one of the Orzhov. It was not backed up by metaphysical, magic or anything like that. So guilds took any chance they could to exploit it. But eventually, in the Return to Ravnica block, Jace Beleren, through the magic of Azor's Maze, or the Dragon's Maze, our favorite set of that block, became the new living Guild Pact. He was imbued with the magic of the Guild Pact, there was a failsafe apparently put in by Azor in case the Guild Pact was ever broken.
Well, I mean, to be fair, you always have a failsafe. I mean, I don't know about your plans, but mine do.
Well, that's a good point to jump off from, I guess, for our lawyer in residence here, is how possible is it to have a small single event like this, sort like the arrest of Zadek and the exposure of the Demir, generate a loophole that dissipates an entire system of law? Is that really possible?
Yeah, I think that's very possible, and it's actually something in real life that we have to worry about right now. I think the better way to understand the Guild Pact is not a contract, but rather as a constitution, as a foundational document or magical set of rules, or however it's written down. If something goes against, fundamentally against the how that structure is supposed to work, you have a constitutional crisis, which is basically what happened at the end of the Ravnica novels. Yeah, I mean, like, for example, let's say today you had the executive branch just straight up refuse to enforce a judicial decree. We would have the same kind of thing here.
Well, and I mean, I think one thing that's kind of interesting, Scott, is, you talk about the constitutional crisis. I mean, we theoretically have a process in place to amend or to change it, because we agreed at some point, and I know that we've struggled with this in recent years to understand that, the Constitution is a living document. It is something that can theoretically be changed. I'm not saying that it should be willy-nilly, but we do have this recognition that 2018 is not the same as the 1700s. Now, we're talking about a guild pact that Azor put into place that we're talking, did Azor, it's just this interesting thing, did he actually leave us basically without, is there a way to amend this thing? It basically is like we have a constitutional crisis that the only kind of way to resolve is not actually through the legal system, but through a Deus Ex Machina type thing, and basically Jace is the living guild pack.
It's Articles of Confederation a little bit. A system that didn't work, and then we had to write an entirely new system that could be changed so that we had something that could work going forward. His system, if it didn't, in fact, have a way to change, it's a rigid thing. It's like skyscrapers are built to move with the wind a little bit. They're meant to bend just a little so that they don't break in the wind. And if his system didn't have a way to change, you're right, over that period of time, people and societies are going to change. They're going to change each other, and they're going to be changed. And if that system of law doesn't have a way to change with it, well, we see it snap like it did at the end of the Ravnica City of Guilds storyline.
So bringing this back to kind of where we are on Ravnica at this point, then.
Why don't we talk a little bit about how those responsibilities were delineated in the Guild Pact? So I sort of prefaced before, but let's go kind of one by one. The Azorius are the blue-white guild. What purpose do they fill in society, though, and how does that relate to the real world for us?
Well, the Azorius they're almost a complete government, because you have the sides of the triangle stand for the three columns, which are basically the three branches. You've got the judicial branch in there. You've got the legislative branch that makes the laws, and then they have an arm for enforcing it, which is the executive. So it's almost a complete government into itself, which creates problems because it's. I mean, I don't know how much rivalry there is between those three columns, but it's still all Azorius when it comes down to it.
Right. I mean, we end up with basically a legal system that, quote unquote, has the checks and balances, but all within the same group in some ways. If we're thinking of the guilds as these separate organizations that are going to come into conflict, it's kind of like basically the Azorius can sit back and kind of be like, yeah, we'll take care of any disputes, and all three of our branches agree with each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's
doesn't seem like
a stable system, but it's not exactly a good stable system. I mean, the Azorius, in all over their flavor text, it's all about keeping things the way they are, doing nothing.
It does seem a very insular governmental system that can be problematic.
Yeah, you've got this system where if they really are the only ones making laws, the only ones with the say, the other 9 guilds don't seem to have a seat at the table then. I mean, they all have their niche within society, their thing that they get to do, but if it's all regulated by the Azorius...
Yeah, I mean, I see the other guilds more analogous, compared to the real world, kind of as executive agencies, like the Solesnia is the Department of the Interior, or Golgari is the Department of Agriculture, and combined with waste and management. The interesting thing though too is if you look at it that way, at least in the real world, you have a doctrine of judicial deference, when reasonable, to the decision-making power of the expertise of an individual agency. And the agency, of course, in the real world, gets to create its own regulations within the confines of the enabling statutes. So theoretically, the Azorius could create some body, not a guild, but some function that needs to be filled, delegated to the Golgari, and they can determine independently within the confines of that directive how to actually accomplish it in practice. There's really no way to, say, declare a law unconstitutional, at least, without dissolving the guild pact.
Which apparently is the easiest solution.
I mean, so what I heard was open revolution is really the only way to go.
Or you have to dissolve Chase, right?
In acid? Like what?
He's the guild pact, right? Like transitive property.
All right, so let's talk about the Orzhov and how they function in the legal system. So how do the Orzhov function in Ravnican justice?
Well, the Orzhov are, aside from the whole weird gangster religion thing, the Orzhov are the advocates, or in other words, the lawyers. I love the fact that the lawyers are black-white because it's so on flavor. The adversarial system and the common law system, really, because common law is, the accretion of doctrine in individual cases with each party pursuing their own interests and butting heads directly against each other. Each one is trying to make a very zealous but one-sided case and let the judge figure out where the cards really lie.
I always run into this as somebody who definitely doesn't identify with black in the color pie myself. The Orzhov aren't necessarily unscrupulous. Some are, but the Orzhov advocates specifically they're just taking the position of their client and leading the case however it makes sense for their client. Is that right? Yeah,
basically. I mean, the black side of it is, in order to get the best law, you've got to have each side arguing as hard as they can in their own selfish position, in order to present the judge with the best case to make the best ruling.
That's a big part of black's color identity, that each person is in the best position to look out for themselves. And when you extend that into black-white tends to be very much about the loyalty to the group, the loyalty to those that they define as theirs. And in the case of a lawyer, then it's they're very much about what is the best for the person I am representing.
I am fascinated too by how the Orzhov as a group, like you said, I love the term gangster religion, but that is what they are. They're a series of cartels. They're all sorts of different mobs, basically, that all unite under this, and then also sort of have a legitimate front. I mean, it is basically like the whole Al Capone gang or something, that the legitimate front is the advocates and the representation in the legal system and some of the, money lending and loaning they do. But then there's all this dark stuff underneath. And so, how do you reconcile that as somebody who does have personal experience in the legal system? How do you reconcile that representation of the prosecutors themselves being that directly woven into, I guess, the money of Ravnica's economy as well?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, in the real world, access to justice is often a function of how much you can pay for legal fees. And, there's, of course, organizations that do things pro bono, and a lot of the large firms, too, actually have pro bono requirements. But, yeah, for the most part, it's, if you are poor, you're going to have a hard time suing a large corporation. My wife, previously at her old job, used to do mass tort, which is basically, they just sued Pfizer and basically they sued Big Pharma for a living. And, but you had the only way to do it economically was to have these massive consolidated litigations, kind of like a class action, although technically different, because class actions don't really work anymore. So you have to have a ton of plaintiffs in order to make enough of an incentive for the attorneys, for good attorneys, to take on their case and take on especially on the plaintiff's side. You have to spend a lot of money in order to just to litigate the case. You could literally be spending millions of dollars in expert fees, and if you don't win the case, that's not coming back.
Are the Orzhov more like the law firms that are going to take on Pfizer and be constantly filing suits, or are we talking something that they're more along the lines of like ambulance chasers?
I think it's a mixture of the two. I mean, it's kind of like, I'd say, like when the Orzhov's financial interests coincide with the financial interests of a given client, then they're probably more than happy to take on the case. But unless there's some advantage in it for them going to the black side of them, maybe they just give it for training to the associate who just graduated from Orzhov Advocate School.
Well, it does actually make me think of how Teza handled the drafting of the new guild pact. The new guild pact was brokered by the Orzhov, basically, the non-magical one, prior to Jace being the living guild pact. And that saw the Orzhov take on a much larger role, I think, in helping to shape the future of Ravnica and do some of that control that the Azorius had done previously. Teza, I think, saw that opportunity to not only help the greater good, sort of the white element of the Orzhov, but also to boost up her own family and her own guild's influence. Does that sort of fit what you're talking about?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's like like at my wife's old firm, they do really good work. They're the people that actually hold the big pharmaceutical companies to account for their actions when they hurt people. But at the same time, they're not going to take on a case that is not going to make them a ton of money.
So we talked about some of the mechanics that we get from the Azorius, things like detain, that really do fit with the flavor of their law side of it. But what's interesting is between the two different Ravnica and Return to Ravnica, the Orzhov actually get mechanics that really do not feel on flavor for the lawyers or for the advocates.
Well, I mean, you could extort, as a...
That may fit other flavor of the guild, too. That might fit more of their banking, more of their... I mean, they are literally called the Orzhov Syndicate.
Right.
It fits a little more of that syndicate nature of them, too, I think.
I mean, you could make an argument that the extort is basically, you've got to pay your legal fees.
That's fair. I do have to ask, too, Scott. So Alex, you bring up a great point that the Orzhov's contracts specifically have, almost all of them have riders in them that say you still owe after death, and they can basically, claim your ghost, your spirit, and prevent you from moving on to the afterlife if you still owe a debt and, use you in service. How legal is that, or is there any precedent for that in the real world? That's pretty grim.
Well, I've actually had I think I've tweeted about this before, is that the law takes it just ignores the undead for some reason. I don't understand why. But, there's a lot of questions. Like, let's say you turn into a vampire. Can you probate your estate to yourself?
Huh.
And, well, of course, in the real world, the undead aside, you do definitely have that sort of thing where creditors can make claims on your estate.
And so you do have those debts then literally follow you to the grave. Wow.
Yep. Yeah, I also love the Orzhov's contract interpretation. Like, one of my favorite flavor text is Executioner's Swing, which is the contract specified an appendage for a mixed payment. Read the fine print. The head is an appendage.
So we now sort of see the landscape of what happens in the courtroom, but somebody's got to enforce it. Somebody has to be out on the streets actually making sure these rules are followed. And so we need to talk about the Boros. They're our third law guild on Ravnica, and actually until you mentioned them, Scott, in our show notes, I didn't think of them as law, but they absolutely are. So what do the Boros do on Ravnica to function in the justice system?
I think that's a really interesting question, one that I'm not entirely sure, because the Azorius themselves have a law enforcement wing. So you've got to assume that the Boros are doing something different than in what they're how they're enforcing the law than the Azorius are. And I think it's kind of difficult. I mean, they seem like they'd step on each other's toes a lot.
think it would be similar to like a federal bureau versus like the FBI versus the more local police forces.
It does seem like they're a little more of the paramilitary side of law enforcement as opposed to the simple the bailiffs or even your parking attendant sort of people. You know, that seems to be a little more of the part and parcel for the Azorius, or the standard like walk the beat on the street type of person. The Boros seem almost like the SWAT team that you call in when things get really out of hand.
I found some interesting flavor text that might kind of help delineate between them and the Azorius. Like on Court Street's Denizen, it says, the Boros fight for justice, the Azorius fight for law. I hold the line between and make sure the people are given both. But it's interesting because the Boros, you know, in Angelic Edict, it says, the Boros built a prison in the sky where Azorius statutes couldn't restrict their sense of justice. Which is almost kind of like a black site, I guess.
So
like the Guantanamo Bay of...
Yeah, we have Gitmo on, yeah.
Let's move on to our real-world discussion then. So
the reason that I kind of brought that up is because we are kind of struggling here with the limited information that we do have on who is our police force with boots on the ground versus what is the Boros kind of doing, whether they are our SWAT teams or they are our National Guard. When do they get called in? But it also paints for me in the fact that they could just be our military, and in some ways this is going to get very political, but it's going back to what I first saw when we hit Ferguson. One of the first things that I remember about that was the fact that we started seeing that U.S. military equipment was being sold to police forces around the U.S. I mean, we actually had situations where these small towns basically had miniaturized tanks that had been used for the military in combat zones. And I actually saw at that point there was a lot of articles that were coming out by veterans that were commenting on the fact that tactics that were being used by the military, by the police forces, were tactics that were actually designed to escalate situations, not de-escalate them. I've been seeing a militarization of our police force throughout the U.S., where, like I said, you have these small towns making purchases of surplus military gear that's more than any police force should need, or I believe really need to have to be able to do their job. And I'm wondering if we're seeing that with the Boros. And it could be that they really are supposed to be the police force. They've just been really militarized. I personally have said this is a conspiracy theory. I made a joke about it at the very beginning of the cast with me getting arrested for helping the guildless. But it being our third time on Ravnica, you have people that, you know, we know the guilds only make up a certain portion of the populace. And we've now seen them under an original guild pack, a revised guild pack that also has this living planeswalker thing that nobody knows what he is involved with it. I think we are getting close to rioting. I really do. I actually would personally love to see the story go in that direction and move away from the guilds or more to what happens to the guilds. Because we've talked about this on previous episodes, especially when we profiled Krenko, that there is a divide between the guilds and the guildless. And if they've been living under Azorius law that they feel that cannot be changed, since they control, like Scott was saying, basically all three arms of the government, if the Boros is the military force, but it's also the police force, we're seeing a militarization of it. That's where we're heading.
And also, too, the other element of that is the people that you would hire to advocate for you, the advocates of the Orzhov. If you're guildless, you're just an average Joe, and you probably can't afford the best legal representation, as we were talking about, too. And so, sort of, well, just staying on the Boros and how they're reflected in the real world first, I do think that is a really important thing that we need to talk about, and that we've seen in our own city. All of us are from Minneapolis area, and I mean, just a couple of years ago, there were police shootings. I mean, there are police shootings that happen every year, but there was a specific police shooting that happened, and one of the North Minneapolis police department districts was protested outside of, not violently, not any sort of way. And it feels awful that I feel like I have to clarify that it was not any sort of, demands or the public was being disrupted or any sort of thing like that. It was people standing outside and camping outside of this precinct demanding to know what happened. It was the family of this young man that was shot and killed. It was, friends in the community. It was people who just wanted the police officers' chest camera video to be released. And that was eventually broken up, if I remember right, and they all blur together, unfortunately, but that was broken up with tear gas, which is, that's some 1960s, breaking up the civil rights movement type action. There are still marches and civil acts that are broken up by police forces in the U.S. today with fire hoses and just these outsized responses. And now I know this isn't exactly your territory, Scott, because you're more in the law legal aspect, but since they are an element of the legal system, that's kind of why we're bringing this in to this part of the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a problem with police accountability. Unfortunately, at the moment, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot that we can do about it. I mean, you can sue a police department, but there's all kinds of immunities that you have to get over, and privileges too. Like, it's a really tough thing, and short of a complete overhaul, probably at the federal level, it's probably not going to happen. I mean, you might see it in individual states, but like, for example, Minnesota recently got rid of the horrible practice of civil forfeitures, where an officer can take your property if you're just suspected of a crime. And it doesn't even have to be a reasonable suspicion. They can just take it, and then you basically have to prove that the property was not being used in the commission of a crime, even if you're, say, acquitted of a crime. It's like that card, was it Render Silent earlier? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's basically a lot like that, where you don't really have due process, and that's a problem all over the country, except for individual states like Minnesota that have gotten rid of it, where you need, say, a criminal conviction to seize property. But unless you're doing it at the federal level, it's you're not going to have a systemic solution.
Something too that we've seen exploited a fair amount in regards to this, that does link in the rest of the legal system, is the grand juries. I think
I can see where you're getting at, and so the first thing you have to understand is that a grand jury, it's a jury, but it's not for conviction. It's to generate an indictment, and it's more of an investigative tool, because it allows the prosecutor to subpoena witnesses and require them to appear and give testimony or present documents or whatever. But ultimately, the question for the jury is whether there's probable cause here. And probable cause is not a high standard, which is one of the things that I find so troubling about, this thin blue line here, where you see a lot of police officers get off through a grand jury.
Right. I think that's been one of the frustrations from an outsider watching. And I'm glad that you're on here, Scott, to talk to us about kind of the fact that this doesn't seem to make sense. Is, to me, I've always been under this assumption of, like, we're not even getting to trial. I mean, that's where we were, say, with Ferguson, is you're telling us there's not even enough to go to trial. Like, there's not even enough to do that. And it seems from an outsider, this is like a low bar that you should be.
It is a low bar.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not to the ground, but it's still a pretty low bar. I mean, you basically just have to have almost a facially valid case where you're not looking at the truth of the individual facts so much as whether there are enough facts that, if they're believed, you could support each element of the crime. In what I imagine is happening in the police, in the case with police officers, is that they're basically police officers acting in the line of duty have a certain amount of leeway, and they're just kind of, rather than leaving it for the jury at trial to decide, just saying, well, there's not even enough of that with the leeway. And I think it expands that leeway beyond what really is reasonable.
So if we're thinking about this from even the perspective of, say, the Azorius, I mean, I've heard it as kind of that problematic thing that you have prosecutors who are having to prosecute the people that they also kind of expect to bring them, to bring in the criminals.
They may reach the right answer, but it's not intuitive with the public sense of justice. Kind of like the conflict between Boros and Azorius, where the Boros kind of want to do justice, even if it's outside the law.
And the Azorius want absolute law, that
Right.
the law is infallible in some ways.
Right. And I think to have a society function, you have to have something of both, where you need flexible laws. Not so flexible that there might as well not exist, but just enough fuzziness that you can maneuver. And the founders intended it to be flexible. I mean, I think it was I forget if it was Marbury v. Madison or McCulloch v. Maryland, but really early cases in deciding the scope of the Constitution, where they just say it's a Constitution that we're expounding. There's supposed to be a certain vagueness for it to stand the test of time, because it has to be able to be expanded and adapt to changing circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, it has built into it a mechanism by which you can modify it.
Well, even aside from that, I mean, the real modification you see most frequently is through the courts, because the courts are fleshing out, take a clause like due process. Everyone's entitled to due process. Well, what do you mean by process? And what is due? What does that mean? Or, that's where you carve out exceptions. Say, for example, to the First Amendment, the right to free speech is not entirely unlimited. There are categories of speech that are outside of it. The courts have ruled are outside of its scope. Like, for example, fighting words or
Yelling fire in a movie theater.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, so one thing I really want to know with Jace right now, what happens when he's not on Ravnica? Like, how does Ravnican society
Like, does
work
the guild pack
when
rule in
the
absentia?
Constitution has left the building?
I believe a day on Ravnica where Jace is not there is just called Tuesday. At least that's my understanding based on the recent stories. It seems like he's never actually there. But no, that is an actual...
What happens when he dies?
Like,
Well,
that
Do they have to have a new maze?
Well, maybe we're going to find out.
Yeah, no, that's a serious question that hopefully they actually address. Like, and what is his job? I think they talked about it a little bit in Origins, but I don't recall a whole lot of the details. Like, what does he do aside from paperwork? Or is that literally the job of the guild pact, is to just fill out paperwork?
Well, I think I read somewhere, and I can't point you to its source. I was doing some reading today, and I remember seeing something about how Jace can make pronouncements that are then essentially incorporated into the magical framework of the guild pack. So, they have that metaphysical enforcement.
So he can do executive orders.
Essentially, but almost like executive amendments.
I think we're even further than that. He's basically the Pope. I mean, he's like he's technically got divine intervention here. No, maybe we will find out what happens when Jace either inevitably dies or
is shirking his duty when he spends weeks on Ixalan without his memories, thus not returning home. Like, some of the other stories, there's some hand wavy, maybe in between the storylines. He went back to Ravnica to sign some forms, but certainly didn't happen when he was on Ixalan. And that was, months? I'm not sure what the timeline was exactly.
Although, I suppose while he's on Ixalan, he definitely has some connection to the...
to Ravnica through Azor.
Because he bound Azor using guild pack magic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is something about the 25th Amendment that we got to find out, because what happens when he's incapacitated? It's even worse.
Or under mind control.
Yeah. Bolas
Like,
is
what if
capable of
Bolas
that.
takes him over?
Is Bolas able then to directly alter the framework of the Guild Pact?
Presumably.
Now I have two things to be excited for on Ravnica.
So then, just to end on a lighter note, a fun note, let's talk quickly about our favorite cards in Magic that show legal effects. Scott, you've got a couple that are your particular favorites, I think.
Yes, definitely. My all-time favorite is Remand. Just the function and the flavor of it is just a perfect Melvin Vorthos merging of beauty. I clerked for a few years in the Court of Appeals here, and so I've remanded a lot of cases. And basically, a remand is, you send something up on appeal, and the appellate court can't decide everything because either you need to send it back down to the trial court for further fact finding, or to rule on something that hadn't been addressed yet, but that needs to be addressed in order for the case to proceed, or to do if the Court of Appeals decides something, but that just requires further action by the trial court, that's a remand. You're remanding the case back to the trial court. You're sending it back down. And so, function-wise, you're remanding a spell back to their hand. You're not deciding it. You're not countering it. You're just sending it back for them to do more with it.
I think my favorite has to be Azor's Elocutors, which we were also talking about off air. And that's simply because it's a card that has the word filibuster counter on it. Any deck that I can play that has filibuster counters, I'm all about.
Yeah, I'm going to take one that's it's legal, but it's actually a little bit more prison-based, I guess. So I'm going to go with Solitary Confinement, just because it's always been one of my favorite arts, and just this idea that, with the law, being able to force somebody to basically have no contact with the outside world is one of the worst things that I can imagine. Kind of even you're already separate from society, and now you're separate from everybody else.
Well, it is a legal thing. It's actually frequently the subject of Eighth Amendment lawsuits.
At this point, I'm just going to have to declare martial law, because that's my choice. I was talking to Joe about this beforehand, and a lot of these law-centric cards, not all, but a lot of them seem to fall into two camps. You either have the counter spells, or you have enchantments, and martial law is an enchantment, and I really like the flavor of it is especially talking about law on Ravnica, laws that the Azorius can create and wield. An enchantment is an actual permanent thing, but it's not a physical object, and that is a really well represented in the mechanics of the game.
I'm going to go with a second hit for me, Absolute Law. Because since I brought it up on the flavor text, it actually is a card also from Urza's Saga. The ability itself is kind of hilarious because it's just all creatures have protection from red. That's apparently absolute law in the world of Urza land.
Yeah.
But the flavor text is the strength of law is unwavering. It is an iron bar in a world of water.
So it busts.
And then it gets dissolved, just like the Guild Pact.
And eventually Jace.
That's our show. You can find the podcast on Twitter @GoblinLorePod, or email us any questions, comments, or concerns at goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. Scott Peitzer can be found at The Booze Cube on Twitter. Joe Redemann can be found at Findhorn, that's FYND Horn. Hobbs Q can be found at Hobbs Q. And Alex Newman can be found at Alexander New M. The Goblin Lore Podcast is a member of the Geek Therapy Network, which you can find at geektherapy.org or on Twitter at Geek Therapy. Thank you all for listening, and remember, goblins, like snowflakes, are only dangerous in numbers.